And when you saw that positioning of those officers, did that concern you?
Absolutely.
Why?
He wasn't moving and he was cuffed, and that's 3 grown men is a lot. Of putting all their weight on somebody is too much.
And did you notice where this officer you now know to be Mr. Chauvin, where he was putting his weight on Mr. Floyd?
His neck.
And incidentally, did you know the person laying on the ground, prone on the ground, who was handcuffed?
No, sir.
Okay. You subsequently learned his identity?
Correct.
All right. And that individual on the ground under the officers, could you tell if he was moving at all?
He was not moving. His face was, the first thing that concerned me is his face was like smushed into the ground. Appearing swollen to me.
And, at that point, are you acting a little bit as Genevieve Hansen, EMT?
I identified myself right away because I noticed that he needed medical attention. It didn't take me long to realize that he had an altered level of consciousness, and in our training, that is when the first sign that somebody needs medical attention. So my attention moved from Mr. Floyd to how can I gain access to this patient and give him medical attention, or direct the officers. And I didn't pay much attention to George Floyd after that.
So when you first got there and you saw Mr. Floyd on the ground, you mentioned about seeing his face, correct?
Correct.
And incidentally, I think in a subsequent interview you had talked about Mr. Floyd's face facing towards the speedway, correct?
Correct.
And
which is just what my memory did, but we know that's not right.
And now as you sit here today, do you remember seeing his face when you were around to the squad car side of him?
Yes, sir.
All right. And so in terms of, his face when you're first there, or even the rest of him, what is it that you saw that made you concerned about his medical needs?
I was really concerned about, I thought his face looked puffy and swollen, which would happen if you were putting a grown man's weight on someone's neck. I noticed some fluid coming from what looked like George Floyd's body, and in a lot of cases we see a patient release their bladder when they die. I can't tell you exactly where the fluid was coming from, but that's where my mind went. He wasn't moving. He was being restrained, but he wasn't moving.
When you first arrived, was he vocalizing at all? Was he speaking at all?
I don't remember.
And earlier you used the term altered consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
And what do you mean by that? What did you see in terms of his consciousness?
Well, we, when we're assessing on a level of consciousness on a call, we'll often first try to just talk to the patient and see if they respond. And if we don't get a response, we'll often kind of tap them on the shoulder or apply sort of painful stimuli. And often I would do a sternal rub or, press their fingernail very hard. And if they respond to that, we know that, we can assess their level of consciousness based on that. When somebody's laying on your, or leaning into your neck, that's painful stimuli. So I could tell that from the sidewalk.
Tell what?
That he had an altered level of consciousness to the point that he wasn't responding to painful stimuli.
You mentioned that Mr. Chauvin had a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck.
Correct.
Did you see where his other leg was?
I don't remember anymore, but I think I may have said something about it in previous.
Did you think it was on Mr. Floyd's back?
I don't know.
Okay. And in that moment, when you first arrived and observed what you could about Mr. Floyd, what did you think you needed to do?
I think I had already assessed that he had an altered level of consciousness. What I needed to know is whether or not he had a pulse anymore.
And, you know, I may back you up just a little bit here, but did you try and assess, you know, how much weight Mr. Chauvin was putting on George Floyd?
I mean, I didn't try to. I recognized that it was an issue right away because he seemed very comfortable. With
Who's he?
Officer Chauvin.
Okay.
Seemed very comfortable with the majority of his weight balanced on top of Mr. Floyd's neck. In my memory, he had his hand in his pocket. He looked so comfortable.
And if his hand wasn't actually in his pocket, would that change anything that you obsessed at the time?
I suppose not. He was comfortable in the position that he was in.
So if his hand, instead of being in his pocket, was simply resting on his thigh, would that change any of your assessment?
He wasn't distributing the weight on the car, on the pavement.
When you first approached, you said you identified yourself as a firefighter.
Correct.
To whom did you identify yourself?
To Officer Tao, controlling the scene. I spoke loudly enough that I would think that the other three officers would have been able to hear me throughout the event.
We know you weren't, well, let me ask you this way. How did Officer Tao respond?
He said something along the lines of, if you really are a Minneapolis firefighter, you would know better than to get involved.
What did you think of that?
First, I was worried that he wasn't going to believe me and not let me help. And I also, that's not right. I mean, that's exactly what I should have done. There was no medical assistance on scene, and I got there and I could have given medical assistance. That's exactly what I should have done.
So based on your training and experience and what you had seen, what did you want to do for this person on the ground?
Had they let me into the scene, I already had decided what his level of consciousness was, so I would have requested additional help. I would have wanted someone to call 911 for the paramedics and fire to come. I would have asked someone to run to the gas station and look for an AED. And I would have checked his airway. I would have been worried about a spinal cord injury because he had so much weight on his neck. I would have opened his airway to check if there were any obstructions. And I would have checked for a pulse. And when I didn't find a pulse, if that was the case, I would have started compressions. And I didn't have my bed bag, so I would have continued compressions. We don't give mouth to mouth anymore. So I would have continued compressions at a rate of 100 a minute until help arrived.
And by compressions, what do you mean?
I would have put my hands, stacked my hands and pressed his chest.
Chest compressions.
Chest compressions,
Yep.
correct, yeah.
And what's the point of doing chest compressions?
Pumping the blood for somebody that's not doing that themselves, trying to get a pulse back.
And were you able to do that, any of those steps?
No, sir.
Why weren't you able to do any of that?
Because the officers didn't let me in to the scene. I also offered, in my memory, I offered to walk them through it, or told them, if he doesn't have a pulse, you need to start compressions, and that wasn't done either.
And so are these things that you wanted to do?
It's what I would have done for anybody.
When you couldn't do that, how did that make you feel?
Totally distressed.
Were you frustrated?
Yes.
Ms. Hansen, as I told you, we can take our time, so feel free to just take a minute. And need a drink of water, go ahead.
Okay.
While you were there, were there other people around you on the sidewalk?
Yes.
And were they saying things to the officers as well?
Yes.
And do you remember what kinds of things they were saying?
No, I was pretty focused on trying to get the officers to let me help.
And how were you doing that, trying to get the officers to focus on you and get help?
I think, in my memory, I tried different tactics of calm and reasoning. I tried to be assertive. I pled and was desperate.
Did you also at some point start raising your voice?
Yes, sir.
And maybe used some foul language even?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because I was desperate to help, and I wasn't getting what I needed to do and gaining access.
And at some point, the voices of the other people around you, did you feel that sort of interfered with getting the officer's attention?
Yes.
So as you're doing that, were you able to pay more attention or any more attention to Mr. Floyd and his condition?
I wasn't really able to. I knew he needed help, so at that point it was just getting in there.
When you asked the officers to take his pulse, did you ever see them doing that?
No.
When you were over on the sidewalk at Officer Tao's direction, were you able to see the other two officers on Mr. Floyd?
From my memory, just kind of their heads.
So if at some point they may have checked a pulse, you may not have seen that either.
Correct.
All right. During this time, did you make any observations or notes about Mr. Floyd's characteristics of his breathing? That was a terrible question. You want me to start over?
Yes.
Okay. During the incident, when you were there, did you make some observations of sort of the characteristics of Mr. Floyd's breathing that concerned you?
I don't remember anymore.
Okay. What is meant by the term agonal breathing or agonal breaths?
Agonal gasps we see in patients that are dying or pretty much dead. It's just kind of the body's. Forgive me, I don't quite know, but it's a sign of death.
And have you seen that in other calls when you've been working?
Yes.
And did you see something similar in Mr. Floyd?
I don't remember anymore, but I don't know.
Okay. So during that time period, he did not regain consciousness that you saw,
No.
and you stayed with him, or I'm sorry, you were there the entire time until he was loaded into the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And at some point, you made, well, I guess the question is this. You didn't pay close attention to Mr. Floyd at some point because you knew he was unconscious.
Needing medical attention, there was no question.
All right. And based on that, you focused more on trying to get the officers to allow you to help.
Correct.
And at some point, did you start video recording
Yeah.
your interaction?
Yes.
And with your phone, I assume.
Yes.
And why did you do that?
It was, I'm not sure why I chose to do it. It's an instinct.
And so you did record it,
Yes, sir.
and based on that, well, I guess I'll just ask it this way. At some point after the incident, you were interviewed by law enforcement officers.
The BCAs? Or?
Correct, yes.
Yes, sir.
And you made that video available to them, correct?
Correct.
And why did you think it was important to record that?
Because memories of witnesses are never going to be as good as a video.
And so you wanted to have it to preserve.
It wasn't conscious, but I'm sure that's why anybody takes a video.
Yeah. And sorry, just bear with me a second while I
Okay.
try to read my own handwriting. After recording that video, you stopped recording at some point, correct?
I don't remember.
Well, obviously you did stop at some point, right?
Well, yeah.
And eventually the ambulance took Mr. Floyd away.
Right.
And then earlier I said we'd come back to that moment in the previous video in Exhibit 11 when the ambulance left and you were still standing on the sidewalk there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
And we saw you just standing there. What's going through your mind as you're standing there?
I'm not sure. I think I probably was in disbelief.
And kind of in shock?
Yes.
And what, and at some point then, did you also make a 911 call?
Yes.
And it had to be sort of, I think distressing was the word you had used before. Did you have, when you're there and you're trying to help and couldn't, did you have a feeling of helplessness?
Absolutely.
Were you upset about that?
Yes.
Did you feel that, whatever the end result, you could have tried to help?
Sustained.
Well, why did you feel helpless?
Because there was a man being killed, and I would have, had I had access to a call similar to that, I would have been able to provide medical attention to the best of my abilities, and this human was denied that right.
And so from that point, we saw you standing there on the sidewalk, just sort of standing still.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And from there, did you stay in the area for a little while?
Yes.
And at some point, you made a 911 call.
Yes.
Why at that point did you call 911?
I think it all settled in that I wish I would have done that immediately, because it was ridiculous that fire station 17 was as close as it was, and that they hadn't been there. I should have called 911 immediately, but I didn't. And when things calmed down, I realized that I wanted them to know what was going on. I wanted to basically report it.
And so you made that call, correct?
Correct.
And a little bit more than a minute long. At some point, they wanted to transfer you to a supervisor, correct?
Correct. I asked for that.
And but then the call ends.
Okay.
Do you remember why the call ended at that point?
I don't know exactly, but there was kind of a lot going on. I was still worried about the witnesses on scene, particularly because they were people of color and black men. I was worried about their safety, and there were officers still on scene. But also, fire came, and it may have been that I ended the call because my co-workers were there and I could tell them what was going on.
So tell us about that. So at some point when you're there at the scene still, did a fire truck come?
Yes.
And they're coming to respond to the call, correct?
They're coming to respond to the call, and they went into Cup Foods to actually look for a victim, which is unique for that, there to be that much miscommunication.
So let me ask you just a little different question. So when they came, those firefighters, did you know them?
I knew 2 of them.
And how many total came?
4.
And-
Driver, 2 firefighters, and a captain.
And so the 2 that you knew, how did you know them?
Crossing paths at work.
So they knew who you were.
Yes.
So you knew that members of the fire department knew you were on scene as well,
Yes.
but off duty, of course.
Yes.
And so you had a conversation with them while they were there at Cup Foods?
Yes.
And you also had some conversations with other people who had stuck around afterwards?
Yes. And the driver and the other firefighter that weren't in the ambulance came back, and I also spoke to them.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
Your Honor, may I have 1 minute to go through something?
You may.
Everyone can just stay on a stretch in place if you'd like.